The lab result came back wrong. Not slightly off, wrong by 4 centuries and wrong by thousands of people. In 2022 and 2023, ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains at Must Farm in Cambridgeshire was processed against reference populations from the Rhine-Meuse Delta, the coastal lowlands of what is now the Netherlands, northern Belgium, and northwestern Germany. The haplogroup signatures that came back, specifically within the R1b L51 subclade lineage, showed a frequency and distribution that the accepted Bronze Age migration model does not predict for Britain at this period. The accepted model places significant continental genetic influx into Britain's Fenland corridor no earlier than the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age transition, after 1000 BCE. The Must Farm signal puts it earlier, substantially earlier, and at frequencies that don't suggest a handful of traders or a single elite burial. They suggest something that arrived in volume. If the dates are right, Britain's genetic origin story has a chapter that was never written. Must Farm is already one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in Europe. Excavated by the Cambridge Archaeological Unit between 2015 and 2016, it preserved a Bronze Age pile-dwelling settlement in a state that archaeologists compared repeatedly to Pompeii. The site burned. It burned fast, probably within a single season, and collapsed into the anaerobic peat of the Cambridgeshire fens, sealing its contents under conditions that stopped decay almost entirely. Roundhouses, wooden bowls still containing food, textiles, personal objects, an entire community frozen at the moment of its destruction. That preservation is why the DNA survived. That is also why what the DNA says is now so difficult to set aside. The Bronze Age people of the English fens were not who we thought they were. To understand why that matters, you need to know what we thought we already knew. The dominant framework for continental genetic influx into Britain is the Bell Beaker migration, a large-scale population movement that geneticists now place between roughly 2500 and 2000 BCE. The evidence for this event is substantial. Ancient DNA studies, including landmark work published in Nature in 2018, suggest that Bell Beaker-associated populations replaced somewhere between 90% and 100% of Britain's earlier Neolithic inhabitants over the course of a few centuries. This was not gradual cultural diffusion. It was, by every genetic measure, a replacement. The Britain that existed before the Beakers was essentially gone. That event is accepted. It is consensus. It is in the textbooks. What the Bell Beaker model does not account for is another significant continental genetic pulse arriving several centuries later, in the Middle Bronze Age, in the Fenland corridor, from populations genetically affiliated with the Rhine-Meuse Delta. And yet that appears to be exactly what the Must Farm ADNA is showing. We already knew Britain was replaced once. The question is whether it happened twice. The physical details of the Must Farm signal make it harder to dismiss the more closely you examine them. The ADNA extraction produced haplogroup assignments that are specific, not broad continental affinity, but subclade frequencies with closest modern and ancient parallels in Rhine Delta populations. Running alongside the genetic data, isotope analysis of at least 2 individuals returned strontium signatures inconsistent with a British childhood. These individuals did not grow up in the fens. Their bones carry the chemical record of a different landscape. The geochemistry points toward the continental coast. 2 independent methods, 2 data sets, 1 direction. That's when a result stops being a curiosity and starts being a problem for the accepted model. Look at a map. The distance from the Rhine Delta to the Wash, the great estuary on England's eastern coast, is roughly 200 kilometers of open water. Bronze Age people crossed it regularly. We have the boats to prove it. The Dover Bronze Age boat, dated to approximately 1550 BCE and now housed in the Dover Bronze Age Boat Gallery, is one of the most sophisticated watercraft of its era, capable of open sea passage, built for exactly this kind of crossing. The North Ferriby boats, recovered from the Humber estuary and dating to a similar period, confirm that North Sea seafaring was not exceptional in the Bronze Age. It was routine. The genetic signal does not require us to imagine an impossible journey. It requires us to reckon with a journey that was happening all along, just at a scale we hadn't recognized. Trade leaves objects behind. Migration leaves people. The objects were already there. Now, so are the people. The material culture at Must Farm itself includes continental imports, amber from the Baltic, bronze metalwork consistent with North European exchange networks, ceramic traditions with parallels in the Rhine-Meuse region. For decades, these objects were read as evidence of long-distance trade. They may instead have arrived with the people who carried the DNA now being analyzed. The convergence of archaeological material culture, ancient DNA, and isotope chemistry at a single site pointing in the same direction is exactly the kind of multi-method signal that changes interpretive frameworks. At what point does a trade route become a migration route? The North Sea doesn't change, only the volume of people crossing it does. Before this was a sea crossing, it was a walk. The North Sea did not always exist in its current form. Doggerland, the broad landmass and shallow water marshland that connected Britain to continental Europe, was largely submerged between roughly 8,000 and 6,000 BC as post-glacial sea levels rose. The Fenland corridor of eastern England is geomorphologically continuous with the Rhine-Meuse delta. The same low-lying, waterlogged marsh and river landscape that defines the Dutch coast extends without any fundamental break in character into Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. When Bronze Age people crossed from the Rhine Delta to the English Fens, they were not entering alien territory. They were entering a landscape that was, in every physical sense, a continuation of the one they had left. The people who carried this DNA were following a route their ancestors had walked on dry land. If the landscape encoded the route, then the route was never entirely lost. Must Farm is not the only site producing this kind of signal. That is what makes the pattern harder to set aside. Emerging ADNA data from other Bronze Age sites across eastern England, including contexts associated with Flag Fen, Barleycroft Farm, and Fenland sites in Lincolnshire, show elevated Rhine Delta affinity at frequencies that cannot be attributed to a single burial or a single anomalous individual. The picture that is assembling across multiple sites, multiple counties, and a broad sweep of Middle Bronze Age chronology is not a burial anomaly. It is beginning to look like a population event, a movement of people sustained over time from the Rhine-Meuse lowlands into Britain's eastern Fenland during a period the accepted migration model simply does not account for. These are the ancestors of people alive today in Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire. Their origin story has been invisible, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because no one had looked for it in the right layer. A pattern across sites implies a cause. Something was happening in the Rhine Delta between roughly 1,400 and 1,000 BCE. Climate instability, population pressure, Bronze Age political disruption, or some combination that was pushing or pulling people across the water in significant numbers. The specific cause remains unresolved, but the fact of the movement is increasingly difficult to attribute to chance. This kind of revision has happened before. In 2015, a landmark study led by Wolfgang Hack, David Reich, and colleagues published in Nature demonstrated that a massive genetic contribution from Yamnaya steppe pastoralists to modern European populations had been entirely invisible in the archaeological record. The Yamnaya migration, which reshaped the genetics of most of Europe between roughly 3000 and 2500 BCE, left physical traces that archaeologists had identified, but the scale of the genetic replacement it caused was not understood until ancient DNA analysis made it visible. Before the ADNA work, the Yamnaya contribution was considered a matter of cultural influence and modest population movement. The genetic data showed it was something categorically larger. That revision is now consensus. It is taught. It is accepted. The Must Farm signal is smaller in scale, but it is structurally identical in type, a population movement that left physical traces archaeologists had already documented. Boats, bronze, amber, ceramic parallels, but whose genetic dimension had not been measured. The ADNA is now measuring it. The difference is scale. The Yamnaya moved across a continent. These people crossed 200 kilometers of open water. The water makes it harder to see, not harder to have happened. The criticism of Bronze Age ADNA interpretation is real and worth taking seriously. Researchers have raised legitimate concerns about sample size limitations in Fenland ADNA studies, about the difficulty of constructing accurate reference panels for Rhine Delta populations given the complexity of Bronze Age continental genetic structure, and about the challenge of distinguishing between a discrete migration event and sustained long-term gene flow through trade networks. These are methodological objections, and they are not trivial. They address the magnitude of the signal, the mechanism behind it, and the interpretive framework applied to it. What the criticism does not address is whether the anomalous frequencies are present. They are. No methodological objection has removed the haplogroup data or the isotope results from the record. The DNA doesn't care about the debate. What the must-farm signal implies, if it holds under further replication, is that Britain's eastern genetic landscape was already substantially reshaped before the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age migrations that textbooks currently treat as the primary continental influx. The Hallstatt and La Tène period movements, the Celtic cultural expansion, the pre-Roman continental connections, all of these have been modeled against an assumed Middle Bronze Age British baseline. If that baseline was already partially continental, already carrying Rhine Delta ancestry in significant proportions, then every subsequent model built on it may need revision. Not total revision, not a complete rewrite, but the foundation shifts. The question isn't just who these people were, it's why this chapter was invisible and what other chapters are still sealed in the peat. We didn't miss this because the evidence wasn't there. We missed it because we weren't asking the question. The Fenland that produced Must Farm is vast. The Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire fens extend across hundreds of square kilometers, and the anaerobic peat conditions that preserved Must Farm's organic material, including the DNA that is now producing anomalous results, are not unique to that site. LiDAR survey data has identified Bronze Age landscape features across the broader Fenland: field systems, trackways, former watercourses, structural anomalies beneath current drainage levels. Must Farm itself was found by accident, during commercial aggregate extraction, not through systematic archaeological investigation. The ADNA analysis came from one excavated site, one assemblage, one data point in a much larger landscape that has barely been touched. Right now, beneath fields being farmed in Cambridgeshire, Bronze Age peat is drying out. The organic evidence, DNA included, is degrading. The clock is not theoretical. Near Whittlesey Mere, the large fen lake drained in 1851 during the Victorian reclamation of the fens, Sub-Peat Geophysical Survey has identified a cluster of Bronze Age pile-dwelling anomalies structurally comparable to Must Farm. The signatures are mapped. The preservation conditions are consistent with those that produce the DNA currently under analysis. The site has not been excavated. It is under private agricultural land. Access has not been granted. No one has gone in. If this channel covers stories that textbooks leave out, this is one worth watching, and there's more where this came from. The site exists. The anomalies are mapped. Somewhere beneath that drained lakebed, in the sealed anaerobic peat, there are almost certainly people. People who may have crossed the North Sea in the Middle Bronze Age, from the Rhine Delta to the English fens, at a time when the accepted migration model says they shouldn't have been there. They built houses on water. They burned or drowned or grew old in a landscape that remembered where they came from, even when history forgot. They left children who are alive today in Eastern England. People who carry, in their cells, a crossing that has no name and no date and no place in any textbook currently in print. Somewhere in that sealed peat layer are people. They crossed the North Sea. They built houses on water. They left children who are alive today. And we don't know their names, their language, or why they came. The crossing happened. The proof is in the ground. We just haven't opened it yet.